So I've done quite a few model renders over the past 5 years. So I've experimented with a lot of different ways to do embossing, bump maps, and to combine all the textures together to get a realistic looking label. And so in this video, I'm going to focus on how to get good embossing and how I would set up my Blender file. I won't go through every single node in this setup. If you would like to find out how I properly set up a label from start to finish, then there's another video on my channel which you can go through. It's like a whiskey label. This will be more advanced, going through specifically embossing and then how I get the effects onto the embossing, like paper textures, foils, that sort of thing. And I'll explain how embossing or a bump map or a displacement map works inside Blender. All right, so we're going to just focus on explaining how the displacement or our bump works inside of Blender. So we'll focus on displacement for this. And I would typically use displacement for bigger movements or areas on the label that are going to be that are larger elements. So things like the areas that you physically want raised, but avoid things like our textures. So if you want like a foil bump or a paper bump, put them into the bump map rather than a displacement. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. But so let's just basically start off with displacement. So a displacement node has a height, it has a mid-level, and it has a scale. And then we'll ignore the normal at the bottom. So if we think of an image, if we want to use an image to plug into this displacement, we're going to plug that into the height. And the image, the height value is specifically going to look at the value inside of our displacement. So a value in this case is from 0 to 1. 0 is black, 1 is white. Then the next one down is 0.5, and so that's our mid-level. And so if we look at it on a gradient, 0.5 in our values is in the dead center. So I'm setting the mid-level in the middle. And then what I want to happen, let's say I want to displace a circle. Then what I would do in my software, so Photoshop, creating my label, I would raise the circle or change the color of the circle to a value that is higher than the mid-level. So let's change that to 0.75. And then what would happen is in Blender, that would be raised up. And I'll show you an example now. But before we do that, let me just tell you that if you want to learn how to use Blender for product rendering professionally, then you should grab our course, Master Product Visualization, which has over 3,000 plus students and will teach you everything you need to know from packaging to modeling to lighting and doing product animations inside of Blender. You'll learn all the tricks and tips while working with real-world examples, allowing you to build your own portfolio. So by the end of the course, you'll be able to create your own professional renders that are the next level above everyone else. So go ahead and grab the course. The link is in the video description and in the pinned comment under the video. Let's jump back in. So this is Affinity Designer. This is similar to Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. And I just prefer it because of it allows me to work in both raster and vector. And I'll show you why that's handy later on. So then I've just got a square image here. I've set, like explained, the mid-level to 0.5, which means I've just set the background color to 0.5. And in this case, it's just 50 on the HSL. And Blender works with values from 0 to 1. So in Blender will read this as 0.5, this 50. And then I've taken the circle and I've changed that color up to 75. So like my example, that would read in Blender as 0.75 because 100% L would be 1 inside of Blender. So we'll export this and put it into Blender. Now, a quick note on exporting these is we want to make sure that we're in grayscale for this case. So what you can do as far as this, Photoshop, you just go up and change the whole file to grayscale. In here, we can use a pixel format and we want grayscale. And I'll explain 8-bit versus 16-bit, but we usually always go for 16-bit. So then I can export this and I'll just call this one circle. So then here inside of Blender, I've just got this exact file set up. So I'll just point you through this. I'll get rid of this principled. Now what you need to do is just set up a plane like this. You need to add a subdivision surface modifier. You can bump that down to viewport levels of 1 and 1. And we need to make sure that we set this to adaptive subdivision. Now the reason for this is displacement physically moves the mesh. As you can see in this example here, it's physically moving the mesh, which means if we're going to actually use a circle or very detailed images, we're going to need the density in our mesh to actually do that. And traditional subdivision, if you didn't have adaptive subdivision on, it would actually require this to be subdivided by a ton. You would also go into this shape and make sure it's subdivided like this. Whereas adaptive subdivision will ignore all that and it will subdivide based on the pixel density or how close you are to the render. So it's going to create a lot higher details. So what I would do, pop this down to 1.1. Make sure you're on experimental and in GPU for your render settings. Experimental means you can access the adaptive subdivision, and then check that on. You can have a dicing scale of 1, and we have viewport scale and a render scale. I've got quite a fast computer, so what you can do, if you do, you can actually come into your render settings here, come down to subdivision, and you can adjust this for both viewport and end result. So you could happily have this at 4, or you could leave it at 8 if you've got a slower computer. You can increase it if you would like. For viewing purposes within here, I'm going to keep it at 1 pixel here. So then what I'm going to do is bring in my circle. We just have the circle here. For displacement, you need to make sure that you actually go to non-color. Then we'll plug this straight into the height here. And then what I'm going to do here is actually go Control-Shift, click, and view this. And so now you can see what's happening is that circle that we had before is being raised up, and it's being raised up by 0.75. The scale will affect this, but you can see that if I increase the scale here, you can see here that we're actually getting that circle is getting pushed further and further. What you'll notice also is that the base here, what we set as the mid-level, has actually shifted. And the reason for this could be that our color here isn't quite 0.5 when we exported it. And this isn't, could be PNG, just changing the colors, the color mode. And so the way you can check this is just search for Shift A, search for RGB. This is just an RGB node. You're just going to click on this color field here, then the eyedropper, and you just eyedropper this color here. And then you come in here and you can see this is actually set to 0.496. So just when we've exported the image, it could also be to do with the view transform changing it, but I don't think that's correct. So let's change that back to non-color. So for whatever reason, Affinity hasn't exported that as a 0.5 value. And so we could actually take this number and reset it. So we just select this number, Control C, put that as our new mid-level, hit enter, and that will shift it back up to the center. Now, what if you wanted to actually deboss this? So let's go 0.01. We'll go keep it like that, and maybe 0.02, so we can actually see what's going on. So we actually want to add some debossing to this. So let's jump over to our file here. We could just duplicate this, and debossing just means go below the mid-level. So the mid-level is 50 or 0.5. Just push this below the mid-level. I'm using Control-Alt-Shift-S to export that. We'll keep all the same settings, jump here, and I'm just going to go -2 for that. Jump over here, bring this in. This is our new one. Then we'll go non-color. And what we can do is combine those two and I just used Shift, and then you right click and draw over the two, and that will combine the two and create a point or an extra socket. And so now you can see here that we've actually created a debossing. The next thing you want to notice here is that we've actually created quite a harsh edge. So this is happening quite abrupt. You can see there's some artifacting in our colors here, and that will show up because it will start to stretch out textures. So how can we fix this? Because we want a smooth transition. Well, if we jump back into Affinity Designer, what we can actually do is add a blur. This works the same in Photoshop. Add a Gaussian blur, and you can just pump that up. I'm going to do this one quite large at 30 pixels. Depends on the resolution also. And then this one here, I'm going to just do a really small amount. So let's go for this one. Let's add an effect here, Gaussian blur, and we'll just jump into like 1. So it's not much. Now I want to point out that when we save this, if we save this as an 8-bit, we're going to get stepping inside of our displacement because it will start to see the pixels change. So we want to export this with as much color depth as possible. And so you can do RGB 32-bit or 16-bit if you would like. I'm going to switch it back to RGB. You can keep it in grayscale for if you would like. Then we'll export that as 3. And so now when I bring this one in, let's bring the third circle in, switch that to non-color. Let's connect that to our displacement and our output now. And you'll see now that we're getting a smooth transition between the two. And this one is a lot smoother than the other one. So let's actually make this more prevalent by putting in a principled BSDF in here. So we can actually see what's going on. Let's open this up, turn off on our world coloring. And the best way I think is just to show you a metal. This is what's actually happening. And so you can see this is actually getting a smooth result compared to if we used like circle 2, for example, in here. That's getting, that just gets raised straight away. And so the next issue we have is if I actually reduce this, would you keep the roughness down? Let's pretend this is a foil or some sort of, yeah, let's go like a red foil, like I'm going to show you an example in a second. Then we'll plug this one back in. The next example I have with lighting, and this will show up more on when we actually do our render. And maybe what I can do is show you an example with this. When we blur it, I look at this. When we use a Gaussian blur, it creates a gradient between the two colors. And that gradient is linear, which means that you can see here that it's going from 0 to 1, very even. But when we do this inside of a label, usually what happens with paper embossing, and if I draw on the screen if this works, paper embossing usually goes like this. something like that, where it's got a turn off and then it smooths out again. And sometimes it even goes like this and then it goes down and then it's got a little bit of a dip here. So we actually want to control that gradient, which is created by the Gaussian blur. And we can do that using a curves node. So let's go curves, search for curves. We'll go for an RGB curves here. Let's get rid of the color ramp. And then I'll plug it into these two. So nothing's going to happen right now because we haven't edited the curve. And then all I'm going to do is change the curve on this. And I'm actually going to stick it in this mode here, because what happens right now is I can raise the curve. See, the curve is going above that value, which means it's going above 1. And so the bumper's getting raised too high. So if we just cap it here, you can press this and it will hit the top. So you can see now that it's hitting the top. But we're going to just pull it over here like this. And so you can see now that we've created this nice taper on our file. And so what we can do with this is you can do another thing where you can just pull this in a bit and then taper it back by adding another point here. And you could taper it like this. So you can add a taper. Now the issue here is if I bring in a color ramp and I'm going to add in a midpoint, and I'll add in 2 stops, and then I'll change this value to 0.5 as well. So what we're going to do is create a flat zone as our mid-level, and then I'm going to change this back to 0.5. So these two values here, in between these two is a value of 0.5. And so it should be sitting in the center, but it's not. And so what's happening here? Well, what is happening is the RGB curves is actually pushing the colors. And so I'm actually pushing a lot of the color into brighter colors and lifting the blacks by doing this. And so I need to get these 0.5 values back to the center. And so the way I usually do it is the same way. So we search for an RGB node. This is just to get our value. I drop this value in the center that we know is 0.5. Then we look at it. It's 0.09. And then what I can do here is bring out a math, subtract, and I can paste that value that I drop it. And then I just want to get it back to 0.5. So I need to go negative 0.5 because that's where it started. So if I minus 0.5, this is how much it got moved. And then I plug that into my height here. And you see here that it's moved back to dead center as long as the mid-level is set here. So how do we actually apply this to a label? Well, let's have a look. I'm going to jump into my recent label design here. We have this. We have, for example, we've got the background, which is your mid-level of 0.5. And then all the assets of my label that I want to raise, I have added. Anything else that I don't want on my label to be raised or have embossing or debossing, I just delete it. And then I change all those values to a value between 0 and 1. So I want to desaturate, get rid of all the colors. And then each one will get a new color depending on the height. So in this case, I wanted the main text, all this text, to be the highest embossing. So I added the highest value of white here, which is 0.95 or 95, which will get raised the most. And then I just changed the heights for each one. So this one is, here is 0.83. This one is 86. This one here, I want to deboss it a bit from this shape here. So I've lowered the color the values here. Anything that you want to deboss, you would actually lower it below the background here. So this is background set to 0.5. So you would actually lower this down below 0.5. So you'd lower it below 50 on the L here, and that would deboss it. And then you want to export this as a fairly high resolution. I would suggest 4K so that you don't get artifacts around anything that's raised. You want to add blur to anything that you would like to have a smooth transition between the two. And then you want to export this at the highest bit depth that you would be comfortable with. So I usually work with 16-bit. You could go up to 32-bit if you would like. And this is the beauty of working with Affinity Designer over Illustrator specifically. Illustrator, these files usually come as vector. Illustrator, you can't export as 16-bit or there's no control. So you've got to send it to Photoshop. Then you've got to add the Gaussian blur in Photoshop, separate all the layers, export it as 16-bit and do it that way. Affinity Designer, I can work with the vector. I can add the Gaussian blur as well. And I can also upscale this. So I could export this as double the resolution and it will just do it straight away. Like it's got no trouble. Whereas if I did that in Photoshop, it's going to have a bit more trouble doing that. And I can also just control the bit depth on export, and it's just a bit quicker in this case. So then we'll jump across to our file. All right, so most of the label is set up like I explained. Follow that video on my YouTube channel to follow this. In this case, I've actually got a extra texture I was experimenting with. So most of the paper texture is down here with just the label color. Then we jump over to just the red. So this is just this one here. It's just a bit of foil. And this has a foil bump. So if you're doing little details that you want to add bump to, do it on this area here. So do it within the actual texture as a bump map, which bumps don't actually physically move the mesh at all. It's just lighting. It's just calculated afterwards how the light bounces off it. And then I've got here the spot gloss for the black here, and I'll show you a few details in that in a second. And then we'll just focus on the displacement over here. So I've taken the displacement map. We want to drag out, we want to search for a displace. Then we want to find our displacement texture here. We want to drag that in, and this is just the exact texture from, if we can get it going, exact texture from Affinity. Keep in mind that my label and everything has it has a solidifier just to give it a bit of thickness. And then it has my subdivision here with the adaptive subdivision. We're just going to select this, go Control T. Patiently wait for it to load. Control T. Yeah, here we go. And that'll give our mapping, which just tells Blender where to put it on this specific mesh. And then we're going to do what we did before. So we need this to go into our height, and we're going to view it like this. So straight away, we can see that it is moving too much. So our displacement is too much. So we'll just drop this down to 0.01 or 0.001, sorry. So that's quite small. And so I'm going to go back further, add another 0.5. It'll read as 0.001, but it's actually 0.0005. And so I'm pretty happy with that distance. And you could leave it at as this if you would like. But I want to focus on these edges. So we'll focus on a bit that's got a nice shadow. So that's looking quite nice. Even that. And you could leave it like this. But I actually want a bit of a highlight on here. and I want this to look rounded. And so we go back to our explanation before, is that if we add a Gaussian blur, it's very linear. So what it's going to do is if we take this edge, for example, and we look at it horizontally, what's happening is you've got this shape, and then you've added a Gaussian blur, which has spread the transition out, but it goes very linear like this. And so I actually want to change it so that this edge is like, actually has some smoothness, and same here. And you can see that that edge here, like if we zoom in, you can see there's like this sharp edge here that instantly changes. So what we want to do is add in that curves. The RGB curves, we want to go into the color here, like so. We'll pop that here. We'll cap it like so. And then I'll just show you as an example. If I can get rid of my pen, and it's running quite slow, so I'll just pause it. All right, so what I'm going to do is just go Control B, and I'm just going to select this area just to focus on that. We'll zoom up a little, not too far, because it actually, depending on how I've zoomed in or not, it actually changes the resolution of my render. So we'll zoom into this far, and then I'll chuck this to cap the height here, and then I'll just pull this like so. And we'll just wait for it. It'll take a little while because I'm live previewing it. All right, so what you'll notice is the displacement has completely disappeared, and we've got that. It's because our mid-level has changed. So what I would do now is just Control Shift click this here. And we'll wait for that to actually preview so I can actually see the color. All right, now YouTube's compression, you won't notice this, but I'm looking for the gray area that is set to 0.5. I'm just going to eyedropper that gray area. And I'm going to do what I did before, except I'm going to plug it straight into here so I can change it and adjust it if I change this. So let's grab this, we'll pull it out, and then we'll look for our subtract. And that'll be a math subtract rather than vector math. And the reason for that is that we just want a single value, whereas vector holds 3 values, X, Y, and Z. So we just want a single value. We want to subtract 0.5 from it to get our mid-level here. And we'll plug that in like so. And then we'll preview it by Control Shift clicking our last shader here. And that'll send it back to all our textures that we have set up already. All right, so with those adjustments, this is where I'm now going to just play around with my different displacements, just to see if I can get the effect back in order here. And so I'll just play around. It's running a bit slower than it usually would just because I'm recording at the same time. And so you could change your adaptive subdivision dicing scale up to fix that, and that would help out a bit. You could also, I think I'm going to reduce my RGB curves just ever so slightly so that we're doing something more like this. All right, so I want to make some quick changes. So I'm just going to disconnect, Control right click to disconnect, bump, any bump map, any bumps, because I think this is affecting rendering times. And I just want to focus on this. So let's go. And then I'm just going to bump my adaptive subdivision up to 4 pixels. I know it's harder to actually see what's going on, but it just will help my dicing rate a little bit. And we're back to this. So well, let's increase my, that's probably quite that's probably too much, I reckon. Yep, so 0.002, get in here. And you can already see that that edge is actually getting rounded off a little bit. So you can see the effect. If I actually mute this, I mean, we've got the adjustment as far as, but just take a look at this edge. And then when I unmute this, I know it's moving quite a bit, but just take a look at how much smoother the edge is when we get these RGB curves in. So that's a lot smoother, and you'll probably notice it more down here. If I can guess where the text is, down here, it's a lot smoother and a lot more rounded in this case. We've also got an issue down the base here. I would ignore that until you do a render. So you could just hit F12. F12 will render this exact selection that we've made, just in a little box here. And let's have a look at this base here. So we've got to choose whether this is a problem or not. And so maybe this issue is either solidify. And so I could drag the solidify after, but we'll lose our subdivision. We could bump subdivision up just to see if that cleans it up a little bit. Give it a render, F12. If you've got a slow computer, then bump it over to solid view before you give it a render. And we'll have a look at this. Still got a bit of artifacting. But I'm thinking maybe when I add in, there's no difference made between the two subdivision. So let's keep it to 1 and keep that dicing scale to 1. I don't know whether you can reduce dicing scale to 0.5. I think that would be too detailed. My computer's turning into a rocket now. But that would result in a lot more detail. Now I don't see that has fixed it. But I don't see the need to go that low. I don't know what the previous render times were. So I'm not sure. So let's just go back to 1. I'll just see if it changes render times that much. So F12. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here. Hopefully some of it is useful. So it brings back that issue. And we got 3 seconds. The 3 seconds versus 10 for a dicing scale of 0.5. So we're more than doubling it. So I'm going to keep it at that. The denoise seems to have got rid of it. Oh no, that's slot 2. So we still got the issue. I'll see what happens when we get back our paper textures. So just hit escape. Then what I did here, foil texture is a grayscale gorilla gold foil texture. Pretty straightforward. I've plugged it through in a normal map. You could just plug the normal map straight in there, to be honest. But I like some of the controls in my bump. So I've plugged the normal into the bump. Now I don't know whether that actually does anything. So I'm happy to be corrected on that if I'm wrong, because that gives the same effect. So just leave that, I guess. The only thing I thought on this one, I think I plugged our displacement back in around the other side, because see what happened is I lost my design in here. So what I did, this is the reason why. Now I know. I plugged it through a bump. So normal can go into bump map. And then in the height of that map, I just grab this output, string it across to height. And there we go. So that's done wonders. We can reduce the strength, to be honest. It seems quite extreme. Although it did give me a nice shine. So what do I want? Do I want the shine or not? Bring back 3. Yeah, I like it. I like the shine. It gives a nicer effect over here too. That could be reduced, I reckon, the height of everything. So just back down to 0.001. And to be honest, that shine could be coming off the label there. All right, let's select the label. Just make sure that it's fairly close to the original as far as the edge goes. So it's not being raised too much, which means our mid-level should be accurate. I know I did change it, so we could have a look at that. Select my mid-level again, reset it. And I'll control shift click over here. Wait for that layer to load. All right. Then we've got the effect down here. So this is what I'm talking about with smaller details, do them in the bump. So this one is just a noise. I've just made noise like this. I've clamped it with a color ramp, and if you smoosh the colors down and adjust it, we wait for this to update, you'll get a mesh that gets little dots like this. I plug that into a bump. That will give me a bump map or a normal map. Here when it loads, updating mesh. So when we plug that bump into our normal for this, you'll watch some of the little details just appear out. So there's tiny little flecks in here that just add that little bit extra realism to our scene. So the bump node is all set to default. Then back here, all I've got is just my paper texture. I've got that halved in size. Plug that in. I've also removed subsurface scattering for the paper texture. These are grayscale gorilla, and I'm sure that the quality is a lot higher, but visually it's not noticeable, and it kicks your render times up so high that it's not really worth it. So then here I've got this. So let's go Control B. We'll go and select the full scene again. And you can see displacement actually should physically displace. Should physically actually displace our model. So if we have a look here, have a look at the edge here. So you can see that's physically getting displaced out of our model here. And just adjust the scale accordingly. So I might adjust this a little bit higher and put a 5 on the end to say 0.05. You'll notice that everything's moving again, which means that our mid-level is incorrect. So let's go for mid-level, select that. 0.85, subtract 0.5. It should really be correct. Well, let's have a look. I just want to put this in. I had the subtract up here, didn't I? So instead of moving the mid-level, I'm just going to move the rest to the mid-level. So paste in that value that we just selected as the mid-level, the new mid-level, minus 0.5, and we'll get to where we need to be with that, and that'll sit the label exactly where it should be. Control Shift click this guy over here. You can also select that and just press O, and that'll link it to the output. There we go. Pretty detailed label here. I know there's some details in here that are missing, obviously. Not getting rendered for whatever reason. And it could just be because we adjusted this so much that it's gone. So we'll go back to camera view. Just going to kick it into solid view here and do a final render, F12. We'll see what sort of render times we're getting here. This is quite heavy on the computer doing very high quality labels because because I want the effects to look great really close up. Another thing with adaptive subdivision is the further away you go, the less subdividing it's going to do. So it is a little bit performant, but with the displacements we're sort of doing. So there you go. So there's the final render. You can save that out as a JPEG, as a TIFF, or an EXR, depending on your workflow. And that's it for embossing or debossing inside of Blender. I would probably go in and adjust this guy, my embossed area here. I would do that just by going into this file here and changing it here. And so that would adjust it rather than actually fixing it within Blender. I would just come in here and you would just raise this. So you'd raise the color value of this, bring it up higher. I don't want it higher than that, so you could bring that one up slightly higher. And then, well, just whatever really. Then you would bring that up higher. You'd go File, Save As. No, sorry. File, Export. This is getting a bit long. Export. We would find our displacement and ignore all the experiments I did. Oops, that didn't work. Displacement 3, save. And you just come in here, escape, cross you out, open you up. Where are you? Grab this. Paste it in here. Displacement 3. Yeah, open image, non-color. I'm just going to quickly save, Control S, go F12, pump that out. And there you go. So it's raised a little bit. I think what's happening is either the lighting is wrecking it, or either the curve ramp is just pushing it too much in one direction. So you would just keep adjusting it until you got what you like, or till it's accurate to what will be printed realistically. All right, that's it for this video. If you're interested in taking learning product visualization professionally, then definitely check out the course. Also, just take a look around the channel. There's some stuff on doing a label from scratch, from start to finish. Actually, how to set up all the masks and everything like that. With a whiskey bottle, there's stuff on how to make procedural paper textures and foil textures, all those sorts of things. So definitely have a look if you're interested. All right, I'll see you in the next one.